The Second World War was the bloodiest war event in history. Tens of millions of people died on battlefields and in even more gruesome contexts, such as concentration camps established in Europe and Asia. Once the Allies knew they were victors, a question tormented the minds of all the world's leaders: how to close such big wounds. The only possible response was the trials and subsequent executions of the commanders and great figures of the Axis. Thanks to the record of these executions, we can see in the present dark images of a time in which humanity questioned all its values. In this episode of Military History, we want to review some truly impressive executions. On the one hand, the main architect of the pro-Nazi dictatorship in Romania. On the other, spies who fell into the hands of the enemy and paid the highest price for their work. In addition, we will analyze the final moments of other infamous Axis figures who were sentenced to this death penalty. We warn you that it is a disturbing video. Let's get started. The march that you just saw on the screen does not correspond to a simple execution. These are the final moments of some of the most important people in Romania during World War II. Among the men who march escorted at gunpoint is who could be defined as the most famous dictator in Romanian history, Ion Antonescu. The seriousness that characterized him during his military career accompanied him until the last of his days. To understand how such a powerful figure ended up on the firing line, it is necessary to know his past and his flirtation with Nazism during World War II. Ion Antonescu was born in 1882 into a family with a military tradition, so his career was marked from an early age. He participated in the First World War, in which he was able to see up close the war horrors that the century held, something that marked his political behavior. Then in the 1920s, he served as a military attaché in Western Europe, later being promoted to a general staff officer. It was in that position that he achieved important military feats, such as the Romanian victory against the Hungarian Soviet Republic. Thanks to that impeccable career, at the end of the decade he was named director of the General Staff School, which earned him the respect of a new generation of officers who saw him as a patriotic reference. During that time, he had contact with diplomatic envoys from France, who were amazed by his personality. In 1922, a French general described Antonescu as follows: of proven intelligence, brutal, cunning, very arrogant, with a fierce will to succeed. These are, along with extreme xenophobia, the most notable characteristics of this strange character. With such a description, it is not surprising that he felt very comfortable as a collaborator of the Third Reich, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. In 1934, he was appointed chief of the Romanian General Staff, but his differences with King Charles II and the corruption that surrounded his family led to Antonescu being dismissed and transferred to a lower command. However, this did not diminish his prestige in the military, where he was considered honest and effective like few others. At the same time, Antonescu had a choleric and brutal temperament. His insistence on discipline made him stand out as a teacher to other officers. That is why in December 1937, he was called by the right-wing government of Prime Minister Octavian Goga to be part of the Ministry of Defense, although in that position, he did not last long. None of the offers convinced the military man until something happened in Europe in September 1939. Germany invaded Poland, starting the largest armed conflict in history. It was in the summer of 1940 that Antonescu ended his premature retirement to return to the center of his country's politics. The territorial crisis facing Romania, with the Soviet Union demanding cessions and the Third Reich constantly growing, sparked protests against King Charles II. They considered him responsible for the terrible situation in the country. To avoid disaster, the monarch appointed General Antonescu as governor, hoping to pacify the demands with a popular figure among civilians and the military. It was a serious mistake. The general forced the king to suspend the 1938 constitution, which granted supreme power of the state to the monarch, so Charles II was forced to abdicate and leave the country. Having complete authority, Ion Antonescu transferred some of the former sovereign's capabilities to himself. In that position, he did not have to answer to any political forum for his actions, leading the state through law's decrees. It was the beginning of his dictatorship. The main aspects of Antonestian policies were those of traditional fascism, a great boost to national industry, marked xenophobia, anti-Semitism, and, as a last detail, a great friendship with Nazi Germany. That union was forged from the meeting between Antonescu and Hitler in January 1941. From then until 1944, Romania committed to helping the German military industry with goods and materials. In this Allied propaganda extract, some of the elements that interested the German government were detailed.
And Hungary had grain, rich fields of it. Grain too good for Hungarians when German soldiers have such good appetites. Hungary had bauxite. Bauxite makes aluminum, and aluminum makes planes. And Hungary had an army. Not the battle-trained German army, but good enough to throw against Russian guns.
Antonescu's chauvinism carried an aspect of anti-Semitism and rejection of the rest of the country's minorities. For the general, these minorities represented a danger to the Romanian state. During his administration, different government agencies designed various plans to eliminate these ethnic groups from the country. This included a mass deportation of gypsies, who generally bore the brunt of Romanian brutality. While the Jews were punished, imprisoned, deported, or had their property taken away, the gypsies were directly shot. The truth is that Antonescu did not remain loyal to any side, and even tried to negotiate an armistice with the Allies and the Soviet Union, but this failed. After entering Bucharest on August 31, 1945, the Red Army demanded the surrender of the country's political leader. Within a few days, the prominent soldier was detained in a prison 60 kilometers from Moscow. On November 8, Antonescu tried to commit which led to increased surveillance of the prisoners to avoid another similar incident. The Russians did not want the dictator to die in secret. They wanted to make political use of his death as a signal to the rest of the countries in the region that collaborated with Nazism. However, after several months in a Soviet prison, the dictator was sent back to his country to be tried by his own people in a spectacular trial that began on May 6, 1946. The truth is that the decision had been made a long time ago. The pressure from the communist militiamen was very strong, and they did not plan to leave the former president alive. The People's Court found him guilty of multiple crimes, including corruption, treason, and the killing of thousands of people. That is why he was sentenced to death at the hands of a military firing squad. Time to return to the shocking images with which we opened this case. On June 1, 1946, Antonescu was escorted by Jilava prison staff to a backfield along with some of his collaborators. There he was placed in front of a post, and while the camera recorded every second, he was shot at point-blank range, putting an end to one of the most controversial and savage characters of World War II. These powerful images are the last we have of the dictator. His figure is a source of controversy, since some nationalist movements seek to vindicate his actions during World War II. The truth is that his alliance with the Third Reich was a condemnation not only for his country but for himself. Now let's continue with the second case of this video, one that presents radically different protagonists. Among the most intriguing and dangerous jobs in history is espionage. Basically, it is the task of infiltrating enemy lines to collect valuable information that can tip the balance in favor of your country. The problem is that it is a job with a high mortality rate for several reasons. First of all, espionage is one of the few war crimes that merits the penalty of execution. If the enemy finds you wearing a false uniform, posing as a soldier or civilian from another side, it is very likely that the cost to pay will be your life. Suppose you are not caught, the other complication is that you must spend long periods of time on your own, without the possibility of receiving help from your companions, since otherwise you would reveal your alibi. This implies significant psychological damage. Not all people have the mental fortitude to be able to carry out espionage tasks, even less so in a war context. Now that we know more about this complicated race, the question is, what happened to the spies during World War II? One of the most shocking cases of that conflict is that of Josef Wende and Stefan Cortes. Maybe the names of these German boys are not familiar to you. History was not too kind to these young men. The look of fear on Wende's face says it all. Next to him, a Christian priest tries to explain the benefits of sincere repentance and the afterlife, but the young man is too scared to reason with those words. Let's briefly go back in time. On September 24, 1944, the two young soldiers received a rather strange order. They were to cross the Mosel, a German wine region, to spy on the North American positions stationed there. But of course, they had zero knowledge about the profession of espionage. In fact, Josef Wende had turned 18 a few days before receiving the order, so he was still on the threshold between adolescence and adulthood. Due to this lack of experience, both Wende and Cortes were discovered by United States troops. According to records, they were not wearing the regular German uniform, but were disguised as Polish workers who escaped from a forced labor camp. That is why they were considered spies, and military justice was implacable with them. On October 18, 1944, they were sentenced to death by firing squad, a sentence that was carried out almost a month later, on November 11, 1944. When reviewing the horrors experienced in World War II, it is impossible to ignore the industrialization of death carried out by the Germans. We refer in particular to the concentration and extermination camps that were set up throughout Europe. They were spaces where human life had no value, where industrial logic was applied to the killing of people considered inferior. One of the most infamous facilities was Dachau, a camp that operated just 13 kilometers from Munich. It was in that infernal place that Johann Victor Kirsch became a fundamental piece for the Third Reich, being director of the entire infrastructure of the place, including the mechanisms of torture and murder. It was those infamous crimes against humanity that condemned him to the death penalty by asphyxiation. These were the last moments of his life. Let's pause Kirsch's inevitable outcome for a moment. After so many years, he surely won't mind waiting with the noose around his neck while we review his infamous career in the German service. Like many Nazis, Johann Victor Kirsch fought in the First World War. The aftermath of that conflict accompanied him for the rest of his life. Already during the Second Global Combat, he was recruited by the Wehrmacht in 1942, where he had a more than acceptable performance. Then, in 1944, it was the Waffen-SS who noticed Kirsch's personnel management skills and his relentless brutality toward foreigners and Jews. That is why, after a 3-week training, he was sent to Dachau to become head of a new concentration and extermination subcamp, Kaufering-Wur, located in Landsberg. His work there pleased all of his superiors, demonstrating a mind suitable for the torments that took place within those 4 walls. It is impossible to calculate the sum of deaths that were the direct responsibility of Johann Victor Kirsch, we can only take as a reference the number of deaths that occurred in Dachau. During its 12 years of operation, the deaths of 31,951 people were recorded. Once the Allies liberated the German camps, it didn't take them long to find the men who worked there. Kirsch was arrested almost immediately, and on November 15, 1945, he was indicted as a war criminal by a U.S. military tribunal. The trial took place as part of the Dachau trials, and on December 13th of the same year, he was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. But he was not alone. Along with him, 35 others would be hanged accused of carrying out some of the most aberrant atrocities of the entire conflict. Now let's go back to that moment we paused. It is the afternoon of May 28, 1946, and Johann Victor Kirsch is about to be executed. After a few seconds, the performer confirms that the rope is taut enough. Out of shot, one of the cruelest people in Nazi Germany is leaving this world. Now let's move on to the last case in this video, the death of a German general who, curiously, committed his crimes on Italian territory. Anton Dostler joined the German army in 1910, and since then rose meteorically through the German ranks. After several positions in the infantry, he was appointed commander of the army's 75th Corps in Italy, his first foray into a foreign country. Thanks to his performance, he was later promoted to commander of the Venetian coast in September 1944. In these latter positions, where he caused the death of 15 American soldiers. On March 22, 1944, a commando of 15 American soldiers landed on the Italian coast with the mission of destroying a railway tunnel between the cities of La Spezia and Genoa. 2 days later, the members of the commando were located and taken prisoner by Italian and German soldiers. The members of the commando were locked up for interrogation. After severe beatings, one of the American officers confessed the objectives of the mission. He had the mistaken expectation that they would not be shot as spies, since they had entered Italy with their country's regulation uniform. However, despite going against international law, Commander Anton Dostler ordered the execution of the 15 men, a sentence that was carried out on March 26, 1944. That execution was a war crime. Over time, the Allies advanced into Italy and other Axis-held territories, taking local leaders, including Dostler, as prisoners. North American intelligence was aware of the decision made by the German general, and they were clear that once he was behind bars, they would have to undertake a severe military trial. The trial found the general guilty of war crimes, and he was sentenced to death and executed in the city of Aversa by a platoon of 12 men. At that moment, these powerful images were recorded. Immediately after the execution, Dostler's body was lifted onto a stretcher, wrapped in a white cotton cover and driven into an army truck. His body was buried in grave 9395 of Section H at the German War Cemetery in Pomezia. These cases take us back to a brutal world that sought to recover from the worst war ever fought. The reasons for each of these executions are diverse, and in some cases, contrast in an ironic way, such as that of the young German spies and that of Dostler, condemned for incorrectly applying the same military law. Beyond those particular details, the result was the same: death. In this way, we reach the end of the video. If you like this type of content, we invite you to subscribe and activate notifications to be aware of all the news. Without further ado, we say goodbye until the next installment of Military History.